The B-25 bombers roaring over Tokyo at noon on April 18, 1942, fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory, forcing Japan into a defensive posture that would ultimately contribute to its defeat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was reportedly deeply shaken upon hearing the news, with his chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, writing in his diary that day, "Today the victory belonged to the enemy." This first foreign attack on Japanese soil in over 600 years achieved far more than its minimal physical damage would suggest. 50 killed, 252 injured, 90 buildings damaged, by shattering the myth of homeland invulnerability and triggering strategic miscalculations that would cost Japan dearly at Midway just 7 weeks later. The psychological impact proved so severe that the officer responsible for Tokyo's air defences committed ritual suicide from shame, while the raid passed like a shiver over Japan, according to Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto's operations officer. The 16 specially modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, each carrying 4 500-pound bombs and led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, had launched from USS Hornet 650 nautical miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than planned, after being spotted by the Japanese picket boat Nitomaru at 7:38 a.m. What followed would demonstrate American innovation, expose Japanese defensive vulnerabilities, and set in motion a chain of events leading to Japan's first major naval defeat at Midway. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pre-war doctrine deemed carrier-launched bomber attacks physically impossible based on rational technical analysis. Japanese naval planners calculated that carrier-based aircraft were inherently limited to operations within 200 to 250 nautical miles due to their need to return to the carrier, and their defensive perimeter positioning reflected this assumption. The concept of using medium bombers from carriers violated everything they understood about naval aviation physics. The technical impossibility stemmed from fundamental size constraints. The B-25 Mitchell bomber's 67-foot wingspan dwarfed standard carrier aircraft like the F-4F Wildcat, 27 feet, or SBD Dauntless, 42 feet. At approximately 27,000 to 29,000 pounds loaded weight for the raid, the B-25 was nearly 3 times heavier than typical carrier aircraft. Japanese doctrine correctly assessed that such aircraft couldn't possibly achieve carrier launches given normal takeoff requirements exceeding 800 feet, far longer than any carrier deck. This assumption proved fatally flawed. Through extensive modifications at Eglin Field, Florida, American engineers had transformed the B-25s for this specific mission. They installed 265-gallon steel fuel tanks in the bomb bays, added rubber bladder tanks, and included 10 5-gallon jerry cans per aircraft for manual refueling during flight, nearly doubling fuel capacity from 670 to 1,189 gallons. Weight reduction came through removing the bottom turret, radio equipment, and unnecessary materials, while wooden guns were installed in the tail to deter attacks. Lieutenant Henry Miller developed revolutionary short-field takeoff techniques that seemed to defy physics. Pilots held both feet on the brakes with half flaps and the stabilizer back 3/4, building maximum manifold pressure before release. Doolittle's lead aircraft achieved takeoff in just 467 feet. Lieutenant Donald Smith later managed it in an astounding 287 feet. The 20-knot headwind over Hornet's deck, combined with the carrier's forward speed, provided crucial additional airspeed that made the impossible possible. Japan's defensive calculations had positioned their early warning line of converted fishing trawlers at prescribed intervals based on observed patterns from previous U.S. carrier raids on Wake and Marcus Islands, where American forces approached within 200 miles. The number. 23 Nitomaru that spotted Task Force 16 was positioned 650 miles from Japan, well beyond their expected threat perimeter. Even more critically, Japan possessed no radar systems in April 1942, relying entirely on visual detection from these picket boats. The morning of April 18th had begun with a routine air raid drill in Tokyo. No sirens sounded, air raid wardens gazed at placid skies, and firefighting brigades trundled their equipment through streets in what seemed merely going through the motions. When the drill ended at noon without fanfare, millions of Tokyo residents went shopping, visited parks and shrines, and attended baseball games. A French journalist in Tokyo captured the moment. "I heard a rugged, powerful sound of airplane engines. A raid at high noon. Explosions. I spotted a dark airplane travelling very fast at rooftop level. So they've come." Japanese civilians initially didn't comprehend what they witnessed. People paused to wave at the fast-moving, twin-engined aircraft before noticing the white stars that marked them as American. The realization struck different witnesses at different moments, some when they saw bombs falling, others when anti-aircraft fire erupted. The psychological devastation far exceeded the physical damage. Radio Tokyo had repeatedly assured citizens that they, their nation, and Emperor Hirohito remained safe from enemy attack, protected by the kamikaze mystique, a spiritual fortress that hadn't been seriously threatened since Kublai Khan's invasion attempt in 1281. The 26th Air Flotilla under Rear Admiral Seigo Yamagata bore primary responsibility for homeland air defense, with the Kisarazu Air Group based at Kisarazu Airfield in Chiba Prefecture forming the first line of aerial defense. The flotilla scrambled 29 medium bombers, Mitsubishi G4M Betty, equipped with torpedoes, and 24 carrier fighters with long-range tanks, all dispatched to find and sink American carriers they assumed must be operating within 200 miles of Japan. Japanese fighter pilots who encountered the B-25s faced an unprecedented tactical situation. The bombers flew much lower than anticipated, approaching at wave-top level before climbing to just 1,500 feet for bombing runs. Some of the first Ki-61 liquid-cooled fighters ever to see combat engaged over Yokohama, prototypes so new that American crews mistook them for German Bf-109. Perhaps most remarkably, Japanese fighter pilots did not attack aggressively even when encountering the raiders. Some failed to drive the attack home to the maximum extent possible, while others mistook the unfamiliar B-25 silhouettes for Japanese aircraft. The complete failure of interception efforts meant that despite Japanese claims of shooting down 9 aircraft, they actually destroyed not even one, as naval officer Shigeyoshi Miwa bitterly noted. The anti-aircraft batteries fared no better. While gunners judged altitude well, their bursts consistently fell to the right or left of the speeding bombers. The fire proved intense but inaccurate, with only First Lieutenant Richard Joyce's B-25 receiving minor battle damage from flak. Admiral Yamamoto's reaction to the raid revealed both personal anguish and strategic prescience. Just days before the attack, he had written to Niwa Michi at her geisha house in Tokyo. "The thing that worries me slightly is that, although the war's only been going on for something over 3 months, a lot of people are feeling relieved or saying they're grateful to Admiral Yamamoto because there hasn't been a single air raid." He warned prophetically that the fact that the enemy hasn't come is no thanks to Admiral Yamamoto, but to the enemy himself. Following the raid, Yamamoto expressed deep distress. "I was distressed to hear that Tokyo finally had a raid," though he added pragmatically, "I feel it was just enough of a taste of the real thing to warn the people of Tokyo against their present outlook." Most revealing was his assessment of military failure. "It's a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane shot down." The raid handed Yamamoto the leverage he desperately needed to overcome bureaucratic resistance to his Midway plan. The Naval General Staff, led by Admiral Osami Nagano, had initially preferred isolating Australia by occupying Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. They had dismissed Yamamoto's warnings about carrier strikes on the homeland as unreasonable, until American bombers proved him right. The acceleration proved remarkable. After the raid embarrassed Japanese leadership, they sped up their debate to attack the US naval base at Midway, with final authorization coming May 5th, when Imperial General Headquarters issued Navy Order No. 18 directing the occupation of Midway and key Aleutian positions. Japan's strategic objectives at Midway directly stemmed from preventing future raids, extending the defensive perimeter eastward, destroying remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet carriers, and capturing Midway as an advance base for homeland defense. Crucially, the Aleutian diversionary operation, designed to prevent Alaska-based bomber attacks, required 2 carriers that otherwise would have been used for the Battle of Midway, weakening Yamamoto's main force at the critical battle. The documented reactions of Japanese military officials reveal an institution struggling to process an impossible event. Admiral Mitsuo Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote with unusual directness in his wartime diary, "Fading victory." Today the victory belonged to the enemy. Captain Kuroshima Kameto, Yamamoto's brilliant if eccentric operations officer, described how the raid passed like a shiver over Japan, a poetic phrase that captured both the brief physical presence of the bombers and their lasting psychological effect. Naval officers Mitsuo Fuchida and Shigeyoshi Miwa, despite their bitter disappointment, professionally acknowledged the raid as excellent strategy from the American perspective. The gap between propaganda and reality emerged starkly in official responses. While Japanese propaganda immediately claimed thousands of deaths of innocent civilians, internal military documents found after the war revealed the actual toll: 50 killed, 252 injured, 90 buildings damaged or destroyed. The military's false claim of shooting down 9 American aircraft particularly galled officers like Miwa, who knew they had failed to destroy even one. Radio Tokyo's first broadcast came before any American announcement. Enemy bombers appeared over Tokyo for the first time in the current war. Invading planes failed to cause any damage on military establishments. The propaganda machine quickly pivoted to wordplay, dubbing it the Do-Nothing Raid. Emperor Hirohito's involvement, while filtered through formal channels, proved significant. He personally commuted death sentences for 3 of 8 captured raiders, participated in strategic decisions about retaliation, and ordered the army in China to totally destroy military installations, airfields, and important lines of communication in areas where raiders had landed. The raid's conception began with Navy Captain Francis Lowe's observation at Naval Station Norfolk on January 10, 1942. Watching Army bombers practice over a runway painted with carrier deck outlines, Lowe realized twin-engine bombers might launch from actual carriers. Admiral Ernest King embraced the concept, and General Hap Arnold selected Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, test pilot, aeronautical engineer with a PhD from MIT, and master of the calculated risk, to lead the mission. Doolittle's selection process at Eglin Field, Florida, began with the 17th Bombardment Group, which possessed the most experienced B-25 crews. When asked for volunteers for a dangerous secret mission, all 140 men stepped forward. From these, Doolittle selected 24 5-man crews, eventually reduced to 16 for the actual mission. The training regimen from February 27th to March 25th, 1942, pushed both men and machines to their limits. Pilots practiced short-field takeoffs on painted carrier deck outlines, achieving consistent launches within 400 feet. Low-level flying, over-water navigation, and low-altitude bombing became routine. The modifications transformed each B-25 into a specialized long-range strike aircraft with doubled fuel capacity and reduced weight through removal of unnecessary equipment. Each crew consisted of 5 specialists: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and engineer-gunner. Among them were remarkable individuals like Ted Lawson, whose memoir would become a bestseller; Robert Gray, who would die in the China-Burma-India Theatre in October 1942; Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, who would become the last surviving raider, dying in April 2019 at age 103. The launch sequence on April 18th demonstrated American naval air coordination at its finest. Despite heavy seas with waves crashing over Hornet's bow and detection forcing launch 10 hours early and 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than planned, all 16 aircraft launched successfully between 8:20 and 9:19 a.m. Doolittle led from the front, taking off first with only 467 feet of deck available. 2 complete B-25 crews fell into Japanese hands, beginning an ordeal that would expose the brutal reality of Japanese prisoner treatment. Crew number 6's Green Hornet, piloted by Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, crashed in the ocean off the Chinese coast after running out of fuel, with 2 crew members drowning. Crew number 16's Bat Out of Hell, under Lieutenant William Farrow, bailed out over Japanese-occupied territory near Nanchang. The 8 captured airmen, Hallmark, Robert Mader, Chase Nielsen from crew number 6, and Farrow, Robert Height, George Barr, Harold Spatz, Jacob DeShazer from crew number 16, were immediately flown to Tokyo for interrogation by the Kempei Tai, military police. The documented torture methods included the water cure, forcing prisoners to consume up to 5 gallons of water mixed with kerosene and urine until their abdomens swelled grotesquely, then beating or jumping on their stomachs. The Japanese government created the Enemy Airmen's Act on August 13, 1942, specifically to provide legal cover for executing the raiders. Applied retroactively, it charged them with bombing and strafing civilians, despite no evidence supporting these claims. The August 28 mock trial at Shanghai Police Headquarters denied them any defense, with all 8 sentenced to death. Emperor Hirohito's commutation of 5 death sentences to life imprisonment meant 3 men faced execution. On October 15, 1942, at 4:30 p.m., Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, 28, Lieutenant William Farrow, 24, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, 21, were trucked to Public Cemetery No. 1 outside Shanghai and executed by firing squad. Lieutenant Robert Mader died on December 1, 1943, from malnutrition, dysentery and beriberi after 20 months in captivity. The 4 survivors, Chase Nielsen, Robert Height, George Barr and Jacob DeShazer, endured 40 months of captivity, including 34 months in solitary confinement, before American paratroopers liberated them on August 20, 1945. Japan's retaliation against Chinese civilians who aided American airmen ranks among the Pacific War's worst atrocities. Operation Seigo, the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, began May 15, 1942, just 27 days after the raid, and continued until September 4th, devastating approximately 20,000 square miles of Chinese territory. General Shunroku Hata's China Expeditionary Army deployed massive forces, the 13th Army under Lieutenant General Shigeru Sawada and the 11th Army under Lieutenant General Yokoyama Isamu, totaling 40 infantry battalions and 15 to 16 artillery battalions, approximately 180,000 men. Most disturbingly, Unit 731 under General Ishii deployed 150 soldiers carrying biological weapons including cholera, typhoid, plague, dysentery, anthrax and paratyphoid. The human cost defied comprehension. Japanese forces executed 250,000 Chinese civilians for helping American flyers escape. Chinese military casualties reached 724 officers and 23,637 soldiers killed, with additional thousands wounded or missing. The biological warfare campaign backfired catastrophically when over 10,000 Japanese troops became infected with their own weapons, with 1,700 dying primarily from cholera. The systematic destruction aimed to eliminate any possibility of future raids from Chinese bases. Japanese forces launched 1,131 air raids against Chuchao Airfield alone, Doolittle's intended destination. Every airfield capable of hosting B-25 bombers was rendered permanently inoperative. The Doolittle Raid's strategic impact fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory through a cascade of consequences that ultimately contributed to Japan's defeat. The immediate effect, forcing Japan to recall 4 Army fighter groups for homeland defense during 1942 to 1943 when desperately needed in the South Pacific, represented just the beginning of resource misallocation that would plague Japan throughout the war. The raid's role in accelerating the Battle of Midway proved decisive. By dissolving naval general staff opposition and securing Army cooperation for Yamamoto's plan, the raid set Japan on course for its first major naval defeat. The diversion of 2 carriers to the Aleutian operation, specifically to prevent future bomber bases, weakened the main Midway force at the critical moment. When 4 Japanese fleet carriers sank on June 4th to 5th, 1942, Japan lost not just ships, but irreplaceable experienced aircrew and the strategic initiative. The psychological transformation proved equally significant. The raid created what American planners called a fear complex that forced inefficient defensive resource allocation for the war's remainder. Japan shifted from an offensive to defensive mindset, expanding their defensive perimeter beyond sustainable limits and making supply lines vulnerable to American submarine interdiction. The long-term impact on Japanese military doctrine manifested in multiple ways. The homeland defense priority drew resources from every theater, contributing to defeats in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. The loss of offensive momentum after Midway, partly triggered by the raid's psychological impact, allowed America to seize and maintain initiative through the island-hopping campaign. Military historians debate whether Midway would have occurred without the Doolittle Raid. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully argue in Shattered Sword that while the raid may have been the catalyst, Midway planning predated April 18th. However, they acknowledge the raid's crucial role in overcoming internal Japanese resistance and accelerating the timeline. Mark Stiller emphasizes the raid's creation of very inefficient disposition of forces that persisted throughout the war. Among the captured raiders, Jacob DeShazer's story stands as extraordinary testimony to human resilience and transformation. The bombardier from crew number 16 endured 40 months of Japanese captivity, including torture, starvation, and 34 months in solitary confinement. During imprisonment, a Bible provided for 3 weeks in 1944 transformed his perspective completely. DeShazer emerged from captivity with an astounding decision: return to Japan as a missionary. In 1948, just 3 years after liberation, he arrived in Nagoya, one of the cities he had bombed, to begin 30 years of missionary work. His tract, I Was a Prisoner of Japan, circulated throughout Japan, reaching millions with its message of forgiveness. The tract's most remarkable conversion came when Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, read DeShazer's story. Fuchida, struggling with Japan's defeat and searching for meaning, found himself transformed by DeShazer's message. The 2 former enemies became friends and fellow missionaries, symbolizing reconciliation between former enemies. DeShazer's fellow survivors took different paths. Chase Nielsen remained in military service, retiring as an Air Force career officer. Robert Hite pursued civilian work while serving in the Air Force Reserve until his death in 2015 as the last surviving POW. George Barr, permanently damaged by his treatment, was medically retired and struggled with psychological trauma until his death in 1967. The Doolittle Raid achieved strategic success, far exceeding its planners' expectations. While causing minimal physical damage, it shattered Japanese psychological certainty, accelerated strategic miscalculation at Midway, triggered massive retaliation against China, and forced inefficient Japanese resource allocation throughout the war. For the 80 volunteer airmen, the mission extracted a terrible price. 3 died during the raid or escape, 3 were executed, 1 died in captivity, 10 more died in subsequent combat operations. Their sacrifice fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. The technical achievement, launching Army medium bombers from a Navy carrier, demonstrated American innovation and inter-service cooperation that would characterize the Pacific War. The B-25's successful carrier launch overturned Japanese assumptions about what was physically possible, contributing to a pattern of underestimating American capabilities that would prove fatal. Japanese military leaders understood the raid's significance immediately. Yamamoto's deep distress upon hearing the news, the suicide of Tokyo's air defense commander, and internal acknowledgements of failure revealed an institution recognizing that fundamental assumptions about the war had changed. The myth of homeland invulnerability, carefully cultivated since the Divine Wind saved Japan from Mongol invasion in 1281, died in those moments over Tokyo. For America, the raid provided desperately needed proof that Japan could be struck. After months of defeat and retreat across the Pacific, the image of American bombers over Tokyo electrified public morale. The mission validated the calculated risk-taking that would characterize American Pacific strategy throughout the war. The human dimension, 80 volunteers knowing their chances of survival were minimal. Chinese civilians risking everything to save American airmen. Japanese civilians experiencing their first taste of the war they had celebrated 4 months earlier, transforms military history into human drama. Ted Lawson losing his leg and writing his memoir, Jacob DeShazer returning to minister in the city he bombed, Richard Cole living to age 103 as the final witness. These individual stories give meaning to strategic abstractions. The Doolittle Raid stands as a masterclass in strategic psychological warfare, achieving through audacity what conventional military power could not. By violating Japanese assumptions about carrier aviation capabilities, exposing homeland vulnerability, and triggering strategic overreaction, 16 B-25 bombers altered the Pacific War's trajectory more than entire fleet engagements. The raid's true victory lay not in bombs dropped, but in minds changed. Admiral Yamamoto's prescient warning that the enemy's absence owed nothing to Japanese strength proved prophetic. The Naval General Staff's dismissal of carrier strike warnings as unreasonable gave way to panicked overreaction. Each strategic miscalculation traced back to those crucial moments over Tokyo. Modern military strategists study the Doolittle Raid as an example of asymmetric warfare achieving disproportionate strategic impact through psychological effect. The investment, 80 men, 16 modified bombers, 2 carriers, yielded returns that shaped the entire Pacific War. Yet the raid's human cost demands acknowledgement. The Chinese civilians executed in retaliation represent one of history's most disproportionate reprisals. The captured raiders' torture and execution violated every standard of military conduct. These crimes against humanity stand as permanent testimony to the brutal reality behind strategic victories. The transformation of enemies into missionaries, DeShazer returning to Japan, Fuchida converting to Christianity, offers hope that even war's worst horrors can yield reconciliation. Their story suggests that while the Doolittle Raid changed the Pacific War's military trajectory, its greatest legacy might be demonstrating humanity's capacity for forgiveness even after experiencing war's darkest extremes. The 16 B-25s that launched from USS Hornet on that grey morning of April 18, 1942, carried more than bombs. They carried proof that innovation could overcome impossibility, that audacity could defeat certainty, and that 80 volunteers could change history in their brief passage over Tokyo.